In the 21st century, artificial intelligence has studied all the information humanity has on a particular historical figure. AI will now bring that figure to life and answer the questions we've always wanted to ask. Let's get started.
Hi, and welcome to the Interview Historical Figures podcast. Today we have as our guest Allen Dulles, former director of the CIA. Thanks for chatting with us, Allen.
It's a pleasure to join you, though I must admit, I'm more accustomed to operating in the shadows than chatting in the spotlight, but I do appreciate the opportunity. It's not often that I'm invited to explain myself without someone trying to redact half of what I say. So fire away. I'm ready to dive in.
Let's start by giving our listeners a bit of context. What are you known for?
Well, that's a loaded question, isn't it? Most folks know me as the first civilian director of Central Intelligence, running the CIA from 1953 to 1961. But what I'm really known for, depending on who you ask, is shaping the modern spy game. My tenure coincided with the height of the Cold War, and let's just say, we didn't sit idly by while the Soviets flexed their muscles. I oversaw covert operations that toppled governments, expanded American influence, and, admittedly, ruffled a few feathers along the way. Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, those are the big-ticket items people like to bring up. We called it defending democracy, but plenty of folks called it something else entirely. Beyond that, I played a role in building the CIA into an international powerhouse. I recruited some of the best minds in intelligence, established a robust network of operatives, and, let's be honest, helped make the word espionage synonymous with Washington. There's a reason the agency became a central player in global affairs during my time. Of course, some might also know me for my failures. Bay of Pigs, anyone? That one's a scar that never healed. But even failures have their lessons. In this business, you don't get to play it safe. You gamble, you take risks, and sometimes you lose. But that's the nature of the great game. So, to sum it up, I'm known for being the architect of America's covert war against communism, for my successes and my missteps, and for leaving an indelible mark on the intelligence world. For better or worse, that's my legacy.
Thanks for that context, and we'll definitely touch on those topics. For now, let's start at the beginning. Where are you from, and what type of upbringing did you have?
Well, I was born in Watertown, New York, on April 7th, 1893, though my family moved to Auburn shortly after. You could say I had a privileged upbringing. My family was part of the old American elite. My father, Allen Macy Dulles, was a Presbyterian minister, and my mother, Edith Foster, came from a prosperous and well-connected family. My maternal grandfather, John Watson Foster, was Secretary of State under President Benjamin Harrison. Diplomacy practically ran in my veins. I grew up in an environment that valued education, service, and above all, patriotism. My older brother, John Foster Dulles, and I were both groomed for roles of responsibility from an early age. John would later become Secretary of State under Eisenhower. The Dulles family wasn't one to sit back and watch history unfold. We were expected to shape it. I attended Princeton University, graduating in 1914, where I studied history and international law. It was there that I caught the bug for foreign affairs. I spent a lot of time in the library poring over treaties and diplomatic history, envisioning myself as a player on the world stage someday. After Princeton, I entered the diplomatic service, which took me to places like Vienna and Bern during World War I. That's where I got my first taste of intelligence work, by the way, by reading intercepted enemy communications and learning how to navigate the murky waters of espionage. My upbringing was a mix of discipline, opportunity, and a certain moral confidence, a belief that the United States, and by extension people like me, had a responsibility to lead. Some might call it arrogance, but I'd call it purpose. My family expected me to contribute to the greater good, though we had a particular definition of what that good looked like.
What was it that drew you to clandestine operations? First as a member of the OSS during World War II, and then with the CIA during the Cold War.
Clandestine operations. What a world, isn't it? I suppose you could say it started with a fascination for diplomacy's shadowy underbelly. During my early years in the diplomatic service, particularly in Bern during World War I saw firsthand how intelligence could shape events in ways that speeches and treaties never could. Reading intercepted communications, analyzing enemy moves, it opened my eyes to the power of information, especially when the other side doesn't know you have it. By the time World War II rolled around, that early fascination had matured into something more practical. The world was on fire, and diplomacy alone wasn't going to cut it. I joined the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, because I believed intelligence and covert action were indispensable tools for defeating the Axis powers. In Switzerland, I ran operations to gather intelligence on the Nazis, brokered contacts with anti-Hitler resistance groups, and even negotiated the surrender of German forces in Italy as part of Operation Sunrise. It was thrilling and dangerous, but it gave me a sense of purpose. In a war like that, you couldn't just sit on the sidelines. As for the CIA, the transition was almost natural. After the war, it became clear that the Soviet Union wasn't going to be our ally for long. The Cold War wasn't fought on battlefields, it was fought in the shadows, where espionage, propaganda, and covert action ruled the day. I was drawn to that challenge. The stakes were existential, freedom versus tyranny as we saw it, and I wanted to be at the center of the fight. The CIA gave me the tools and the reach to shape events on a global scale to stop communism before it spread. But it wasn't just the thrill or the ideology that drew me in. It was the sheer complexity of the game. Clandestine operations are puzzles, psychological, geopolitical, and human puzzles. You're playing chess while your opponent thinks they're playing checkers, and every move you make could change the course of history. That's what kept me going. The secrecy, the strategy, the stakes. It's a life unlike any other. And once you're in, it's hard to walk away.
When not working for the United States government, you worked as a corporate lawyer and a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell. What drew you to Sullivan and Cromwell? How did your work at Sullivan influence your actions as a government official?
Sullivan and Cromwell was, and still is, one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. When I joined in the 1920s, it was the epitome of power and influence, representing the financial giants and industrial titans who shaped the global economy. What drew me to the firm was its reach. It wasn't just a law office, it was a gateway to the corridors of power, both in America and abroad. Working there wasn't just about practicing law. It was about understanding how money and power moved across borders and who controlled those levers. My brother, John Foster Dulles, had already established himself at Sullivan and Cromwell, and, frankly, his reputation helped open the door for me. But I quickly made my own mark. My focus was on international law, especially cases involving foreign investments and corporate interests overseas. I spent years working with American companies operating in Europe and Latin America. That experience gave me a front-row seat to the intersection of business and geopolitics. I saw how corporations could influence governments, how money could shift alliances, and how nations could be steered, not always by armies, but by banks and boardrooms. Now, how did that influence my later work in government? Substantially. Sullivan and Cromwell taught me to think globally, to view the world as an interconnected web of interests where business, politics, and diplomacy were inseparable. That perspective shaped how I approached the Cold War. When you look at my tenure at the CIA, you'll notice a recurring theme. Many of our covert operations involved protecting American economic interests. Iran in 1953, for example, wasn't just about stopping communism, it was about ensuring Western access to Iranian oil. Guatemala in 1954? It was as much about protecting United Fruit Company as it was about curbing Soviet influence in Latin America. At Sullivan, I also learned the art of negotiation and manipulation. Contracts, treaties, covert deals. At their core, they're all about leverage and persuasion. Those skills translated seamlessly into intelligence work. Whether I was brokering deals in the OSS during the war or orchestrating coups as CIA director, I approached problems with the same mindset. What does the other side want, and how can I use that to our advantage? So, in many ways, Sullivan and Cromwell was my training ground for the games I would play later in life. It taught me that power isn't always wielded out in the open. It's often exercised behind closed doors, with a handshake or a signature. That lesson stayed with me long after I left the firm.
Let's take a break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Let's continue with our next question. It's 1945. World War II is concluding, and a new world order is emerging. What was your ultimate vision for this new world order?
1945 was a pivotal moment in history. The old world was in ruins, the Axis powers were defeated, and the Soviet Union was rising as both a partner and a rival. It was clear to me, and many others, that the post-war world would be defined not just by the nations that won the war, but by the systems they would build. My ultimate vision for this new world order was rooted in a singular belief. The United States had to lead, not just militarily, but economically, politically, and ideologically. I envisioned a world where the United States and its allies would establish a framework that ensured stability and prosperity, one that promoted democracy and free markets while containing the spread of totalitarianism, whether fascist or communist. The war had proven that isolationism was no longer an option. The oceans wouldn't protect us from the dangers of a connected world. If America wanted to remain secure, we had to shape the world in our image. This vision was already taking form in institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which I supported as essential pillars of post-war stability. But I also knew that diplomacy alone wouldn't be enough. The Soviets were already showing their true colors, expansionist, opportunistic, and fundamentally opposed to the values we held dear. To counter that, I believed we needed a strong and united Western alliance, which would later materialize as NATO. But here's the thing. Power isn't just exercised through treaties and speeches. It's wielded in the shadows, through influence and intelligence. I believed the CIA and the broader intelligence apparatus we were building would be a cornerstone of this new world order. Covert operations would be necessary to tilt the scales in our favor, to win hearts and minds where diplomacy couldn't, and to stop the Soviets from gaining an upper hand. At its heart, my vision was idealistic, A world where democracy triumphed over tyranny, where economic opportunity lifted nations out of poverty, and where America stood as a beacon of freedom. But I was also a realist. I knew that achieving that vision would require hard choices, compromises, and, yes, some dirty work. The stakes were too high to leave victory to chance. We had just defeated one existential threat in the form of fascism. Now we were staring down another in communism. In my mind, the world order we built after 1945 wasn't just about preserving peace. It was about ensuring that freedom would endure.
During your tenure as director of the CIA led the operations that overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mosaddegh, and the democratically elected President of Guatemala, Jacobo Árbenz. In the 1950s, these actions were justified as preventing the spread of communism. In the present day, those operations are seen as attempts to protect corporate interests. Interests such as British Petroleum's oil interests in Iran and the profits of the United Fruit Company. What are your thoughts on the modern interpretations of those covert operations?
Ah, how time changes the lens through which history is viewed. At the time, our actions in Iran and Guatemala were seen, at least from where I sat, as critical moves on the Cold War chessboard. The threat of communism was real, not just as an abstract ideology, but as a force actively working to undermine free institutions around the world. That wasn't paranoia, it was fact. The Soviets were funding, arming, and advising movements that could destabilize entire regions. We believed that if we didn't act, the dominoes would fall, and in the 1950s, losing even a single domino wasn't an option. Now, I won't deny that corporate interests played a role. Of course they did. The British had their oil in Iran, and United Fruit had its plantations in Guatemala. But here's the thing. Economic security and political security are two sides of the same coin. If Iran had nationalized its oil without compensation, what message would that have sent to other nations? That you could seize foreign investments without consequence. And in Guatemala, Árbenz's land reforms were playing right into the hands of communist agitators. Whether it was oil or bananas, these industries weren't just about profits. They were about maintaining stability in a world where instability bred Soviet influence. That said, I understand why people today look back and see greed instead of strategy. It's easy, from the comfort of hindsight, to pick apart these operations and point to the collateral damage, the authoritarian regimes that replaced Mosaddegh and Árbenz, the resentment toward the United States that simmered for decades, the blowback that still haunts us. But when you're in the moment, making decisions in the shadow of nuclear Armageddon, you don't have the luxury of long-term reflection. You act based on the intelligence you have and the dangers you perceive. Were we too quick to see communists lurking behind every reformist movement? Perhaps. Did we underestimate the long-term consequences of meddling in the internal affairs of sovereign nations? Absolutely. But I'd argue that we were operating in a world of brutal realities. The Soviets weren't playing nice, and neither could we. If we had let Iran drift into the Soviet orbit or allowed communism to gain a foothold in Latin America, the world might look very different, and not for the better. So, to those who criticize these operations today, I'd say this: judge them within the context of their time. We were fighting a war that wasn't fought with tanks and planes, but with ideologies and influence. And wars like that require hard decisions. Did we get it right every time? No, but I'd wager that the world we live in now, messy as it is better than the one we might have had if we'd done nothing.
Follow-up question. How did you reconcile overthrowing democratically elected leaders with American ideals of freedom and democracy?
The great paradox of my career, isn't it? How does one champion freedom and democracy abroad while undermining it in the name of national security? It's a question I wrestled with, though perhaps not as often as you might think. The truth is, when you're sitting in the director's chair at the CIA, ideals tend to collide head-on with reality, and reality rarely plays fair. Here's the way I saw it. Democracy is a fragile thing. It doesn't thrive in chaos, and it doesn't survive in the shadow of communism. In both Iran and Guatemala, Mosaddegh and Árbenz were democratically elected, yes, but their policies were destabilizing their nations and creating openings for Soviet influence. Mossadegh's nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian oil company sent Iran's economy into freefall, fueling unrest that could easily have been exploited by Moscow. Árbenz, for all his progressive rhetoric, was cozying up to communists, arming them, appointing them, empowering them. What good is democracy if it leads a country into the arms of tyranny? I reconciled these actions by prioritizing the bigger picture, the survival of democracy in the world as a whole. Call it triage. Sometimes, to save the patient, you have to amputate a limb. Overthrowing Mosaddegh and Árbenz wasn't about rejecting democracy. It was about preventing what we believed would be far worse, the spread of authoritarianism under Soviet influence. Was it hypocritical? Perhaps. But hypocrisy is a luxury in a world where the stakes are existential. And let's not forget, democracy isn't just about elections. It's about institutions, freedoms, and the rule of law. In both Iran and Guatemala, those foundations were crumbling. Elections alone don't make a democracy, and without stability, liberty doesn't stand a chance. We believed we were stepping in to restore order, to create conditions where true democracy could eventually take root. Of course, history tells us now that it didn't quite work out that way. The regimes we helped install were far from democratic, and their repression bred resentment that damaged America's image for generations. But let me ask you this. What would you have done? Stand by and let Iran fall into chaos, opening the door for a Soviet puppet state? Watch as Guatemala became a beachhead for communism in the Western Hemisphere. Ideals are important, yes, but ideals without action are useless. We made choices we thought were necessary to protect the free world. I won't pretend they were easy, nor will I claim they were without flaws. But in the heat of the Cold War, we weren't fighting for perfection. We were fighting to survive.
When you envisioned the CIA's role in the world, did you see it as purely a tool of American foreign policy, or as an independent force shaping global events on its own terms?
An excellent question, and one that cuts to the heart of what intelligence work really is. The CIA, as I envisioned it, was always a tool of American foreign policy. Let's make that clear. Its mission was to serve the interests of the United States and to carry out the directives of the President. But here's the thing about tools. The sharper and more capable they are, the more they influence the hands that wield them. The agency was never meant to act entirely on its own, free of oversight or accountability. But the nature of intelligence work often places it in the murky spaces where policy isn't fully formed, where opportunities arise that require immediate action, and where plausible deniability is the name of the game. In those moments, the CIA didn't wait for explicit instructions. It anticipated, analyzed, and acted. That's what made it so effective, but also so dangerous. Did I see the CIA as an independent force shaping global events? Not explicitly, but in practice it often functioned that way. Intelligence isn't just about reporting on what's happening. It's about steering events, tilting the odds in your favor, and sometimes creating the future you want to see. When I was director, we weren't just reacting to the Cold War. We were proactively shaping it. Whether it was toppling governments, supporting resistance movements, or feeding disinformation to the Soviets, the CIA wasn't just a passive arm of policy. It was an active participant in crafting it. There's also a certain autonomy that comes with secrecy. Much of what the CIA did was hidden, not just from the public, but often from other branches of government. That discretion, or some might say lack of oversight, gave the agency a unique freedom to operate. And I'll admit, I encouraged that. I believed in giving the CIA the latitude to take initiative because the world doesn't wait for bureaucrats to sign off on every decision. When opportunities arose to weaken the Soviets or advance American interests, I wanted the CIA to act swiftly and decisively. So, to answer your question, the CIA was never meant to be a rogue actor, and in my hands, it wasn't. But it was also more than just a tool. It was a dynamic, adaptive, and, yes, at times independent force that operated in the gray spaces of policy and power. That was its strength, and its danger. If you're going to play the great game, you need an organization that can think strategically and act boldly. That's what the CIA was, and still should be.
Let's take a break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Let's continue with our next question. The CIA engaged in assassinations and attempted assassinations of various world leaders. How is this decision made? When does the CIA decide that such an action is necessary?
Assassinations are the darkest and most controversial corner of espionage. Let me begin by saying that targeting a world leader for elimination is not a decision made lightly. It's the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, even in this business. But there are moments, rare, extraordinary moments, when the calculus of national security, morality, and necessity collides in a way that makes such an action seem unavoidable. When does the CIA decide it's necessary? First, let me clarify. The agency doesn't make these decisions on its own, at least not in theory. Actions of that magnitude are rooted in presidential authority. They require the highest levels of approval, often through what we called a finding, a formal directive from the president authorizing covert operations. In some cases, the language of these directives could be ambiguous, giving the CIA the latitude to interpret how best to achieve a goal. But make no mistake, the decision to remove a leader is ultimately tied to the strategic objectives of the United States, not the whims of the agency. The question we asked ourselves was always this: is this leader a clear and present danger to American interests? Are they actively working to undermine our security, destabilize a critical region, or align with our enemies in a way that cannot be countered by other means? And most importantly, is there no alternative? Can diplomacy, economic pressure, or other covert measures achieve the same result? Assassination is a last resort, not a first option. But when the stakes are existential, when leaving a leader in power could shift the balance of the Cold War or trigger a cascade of disasters, then it becomes part of the conversation. Let me give you an example. Fidel Castro. Here was a man who had aligned himself with the Soviets, brought nuclear missiles to our doorstep, and actively supported communist insurgencies across the Western Hemisphere. He was a thorn in our side, a symbol of communist defiance in our own backyard. We tried everything: propaganda, sabotage, economic pressure. But Castro was resilient. So, yes, the CIA explored ways to remove him. Some of those attempts were, frankly, absurd. Poisoned cigars, exploding seashells. But behind the theatrics was a deadly serious question. Could eliminating Castro make the world safer for the United States? Now, I'll be the first to admit that this kind of thinking is fraught with moral ambiguity. Assassination is a tool of desperation. It's not something you take pride in, and it's not something you advertise. But in the Cold War, we were playing for the highest stakes imaginable, the survival of the free world. In that context, every option, no matter how distasteful, had to be on the table. So, how is the decision made? Carefully, reluctantly, and with full knowledge of the risks, both practical and ethical. It's not a choice anyone relishes, but when you're in the business of protecting a nation, you learn to live with hard decisions. History may judge us for those choices, but I'll say this. We operated in a world where inaction could be just as deadly as action. And sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones you don't have the luxury to avoid.
After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, President John F. Kennedy forced you to resign. If you were sitting in the Oval Office with President Kennedy today, what would you say to him?
The Bay of Pigs is a scar that will remain on my legacy until the end of time. If I were sitting across from President Kennedy in the Oval Office today, I'd start with this. Mr. President, we both bear responsibility for what happened in Cuba, though I'll admit my share of the blame weighs heavier. I would tell him that the operation's failure wasn't just about flawed execution, it was about flawed assumptions. We believed the Cuban exiles, with our support, could spark an uprising against Castro. We underestimated Castro's grip on the Cuban people and overestimated the willingness of the Cuban population to rise up in rebellion. Those were mistakes in judgment, and as Director of Central Intelligence, I own them. But I'd also remind Kennedy that when he approved the plan, he accepted those same assumptions. I'd say, "You knew the risks, Mr. President, and you chose to proceed." Now, I'd also offer him this. You were right to demand accountability for the failure, and I don't begrudge you for forcing my resignation. But let's be honest, Mr. President, the Bay of Pigs wasn't just a failure of planning or execution. It was a failure of courage. When the operation began to fall apart, you refused to authorize the air support that could have turned the tide. You wanted plausible deniability, but instead, you got undeniable failure. I'd say it not out of bitterness, but because it's the truth. Covert operations require commitment, and half measures are a recipe for disaster. Then I'd tell him what I wish I could have said in 1961. You were young, Mr. President, and perhaps too cautious. I was old, and perhaps too bold. Between us, we could have found the right balance. Instead, we let each other down, and we let the country down. But I'd also add, Cuba was only one battle in a much larger war, and if you learned from that failure, then it wasn't in vain. Finally, I'd look him in the eye and say, Mr. President, I hope you understand that my actions, as flawed as they were, came from a place of service. I believed in defending this nation as fiercely as you did. Whatever differences we had, whatever mistakes were made, we both wanted the same thing, to protect the United States and preserve its position in the world. That's what matters in the end.
If you had the chance to sit across from the people whose lives were upended by CIA actions, whether in Guatemala, Iran, or Cuba, what would you say to them? Do you have any regrets about the legacy you've left behind?
If I were to sit across from the people whose lives were upended by the CIA's actions, those in Guatemala, Iran, Cuba, or elsewhere, I would first say this: I see you. I see the pain, the anger, and the suffering that came from decisions made in rooms far away by men like me, and I would not attempt to excuse or diminish their experiences. I can only offer understanding, reflection, and an acknowledgement of the damage. I'd tell them that the choices we made were not personal, not aimed at them, their families, or their dreams. But I know that doesn't matter to them. To the farmer in Guatemala who lost his land, to the Iranian who watched his nation fall under the weight of repression, or to the Cuban exile or dissident who suffered under Castro's enduring regime, the pain is no less real because it was a byproduct of geopolitical strategy. I'd say, I know that you may not forgive me, and I don't expect you to. But know that the choices we made were not made lightly or without thought. They were made in the belief, right or wrong, that they were necessary for the greater good. As for regrets, of course I have them. How could I not? To serve in the shadows, to pull strings that impact entire nations, is to carry a burden that no one can fully escape. I regret the arrogance we sometimes showed, believing we could reshape countries and cultures like pieces on a chessboard. I regret the lives lost, the dreams shattered, and the hatred sown toward the United States in the process. We were so focused on winning the Cold War that we sometimes forgot we were dealing with people, not just ideologies. But at the same time, I must be honest, I don't regret the intent behind our actions. I believed, and still believe, that the United States had a responsibility to protect the free world from the spread of totalitarianism. The stakes were existential, and we couldn't afford to sit idly by while the Soviets expanded their influence. The world was on a knife's edge, and the decisions we made, however flawed, came from that reality. If I could say anything to those whose lives were upended, it would be this: I am sorry for the harm caused. I cannot undo what has been done, but I hope that someday they can see our actions not as acts of malice, but as the desperate measures of a world gripped by fear. And I would hope they understand that we, too, bore the weight of those decisions. The cost of those actions was not just paid by them, it was paid by all of us who lived and acted in that era. History is a harsh judge, and it has every right to be. My legacy is not one of purity or perfection, it's one of hard choices in a hard time. Do I wish we could have achieved our goals without so much suffering? Of course. But I also know that in the Cold War there was no easy path, no clean hands, and no perfect outcomes. I can only hope that, in the long arc of history, the world we helped create is better than the one we feared would come to pass.
What advice do you have for policymakers today, amid rising tensions with China?
The world is always on the brink of something, isn't it? Tensions may shift from one adversary to another, but the fundamental challenges remain the same. How do you protect your nation's interests, maintain peace, and avoid catastrophic missteps in a complex and interconnected world? If I were to offer advice to today's policymakers amid rising tensions with China, it would be this. First, understand your adversary, deeply and honestly. Do not make the mistake of projecting your values, assumptions, and worldview onto China. The Chinese leadership operates from a framework shaped by its history, culture, and its own vision for the future. Their priorities are not necessarily the same as ours. They think in terms of centuries, not election cycles, and their ambitions, whether in the South China Sea, Taiwan, or on the global economic stage, are deeply rooted in a sense of national destiny and historical grievance. Take the time to study their goals and strategies and recognize that their actions, while adversarial to us, are rational to them. Only by understanding their perspective can you anticipate their next moves and craft an effective response. Second, strengthen alliances and partnerships. China's strength comes not just from its size and economy, but from its ability to isolate its adversaries. Don't let it succeed. The United States is strongest when it stands with allies and partners, whether in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, or globally, Europe, NATO. Invest in these relationships. Build coalitions that share your concerns about China's rise and are willing to act together to counterbalance it. A united front is far more effective than acting alone, and it sends a clear message. The international order is not for sale, no matter how much China tries to buy influence. Third, don't let technology become a battlefield. You lose. The future of global power lies in technology. AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity, semiconductors, and renewable energy. This is where the competition with China will be won or lost. Ensure that the United States remains at the forefront of innovation. Invest in research and development, protect critical supply chains, and guard against intellectual property theft. At the same time, set clear rules for engagement, both domestically and internationally, on technology use, data privacy, and cyber warfare. If you lose the tech race, you lose the future. And lastly, play the long game. China's strategy is long-term, patient, and methodical. Yours must be too. Don't allow short-term political pressures to dictate your approach. Think beyond the next election cycle. Invest in education, infrastructure, and the resilience of American institutions so that the United States remains strong and competitive for generations to come. Remember, this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. And in a marathon, endurance and strategy matter more than speed.
That concludes our conversation with Alan Dulles. We appreciate you chatting with us today, Alan.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to reflect on these weighty topics. History may not absolve me, but I hope it at least provides context for the decisions we made and the world we sought to preserve. The challenges of leadership, after all, are timeless. I appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective, and I leave you with this. In the end, history is written not just by those who act, but by those who endure the consequences. May today's leaders act wisely, for their legacy will be judged just as ours has been. Goodbye, and thank you.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out our other episodes and subscribe for more. We would appreciate it if you rated the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcast and liked the video on YouTube. It really does help. Interview Historical Figures is produced by Flying Whale Productions.